bid now to the Minister for Energy and the Environment, Josh Frydenberg. He's with me now. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Nice to be with you, David.
Before we get to energy and the environment, let me ask you about what's been playing out in question time this afternoon. Tony Abbott says he was not aware of this email in August last year that went from Michael Keenan's office to David Leyonhjelm about the gun importation ban. Michael Keenan says he was kept up to date on all of this. Who do you believe?
Well, David, this is just politicking from the Labor Party because we're talking about the industrial relations debate. It goes back to the history of this issue. Back in 2015, we put in a prohibition on the importation of the Adler shotgun based on the fact that the states and the territories hadn't agreed through COAG on the review and the conclusions of that review into the National Firearms Agreement. Now, that is yet to conclude, and when it does, we'll have a better idea. But that prohibition is in place because of the Abbott and the Turnbull governments. And it's the Labor Party which in the last parliament twice blocked mandatory minimum sentence of illegal trafficking of firearms. And it's the Prime Minister who told us today in Parliament that more than 90% of gun-related crimes relate to the illegal trafficking of firearms.
Sure, and I appreciate the position on all of that, but it's within your own party that we have Tony Abbott saying one thing and Michael Keenan, backed by Malcolm Turnbull, saying another.
Well, look, the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, explained the chronology of events when he was in government after question time, as you know. He made that explanation. He said that...
Who you believe? Do you believe him?
Well, look, I don't see that there is this clash that the Labor Party is now trying to make out. I think that the main position here is that we do have strong gun laws. We would never water down John Howard's incredible legacy in this space. And it's the Labor Party who have to now answer, David, why they didn't support in the last parliament twice the changes to the mandatory minimum penalties for gun trafficking.
And would you be happy to see this gun imported with the right classification on it?
Well, I don't like to see any guns to be imported, but that is an issue that will be obviously resolved through the COAG process. I don't want to prejudge it, it's not my portfolio, other than to say the current classification at A is the lowest classification, and that's what drove the prohibition in the first place.
Yeah, and the PM says if they can tighten that classification, they'll lift the import ban. So,
well, I can tell you the Prime Minister, like everyone, is concerned about the public safety, perhaps more than anyone, as the Prime Minister.
Let's turn to your portfolio. Yesterday, the Australian Energy Market Regulator gave an update on the September 28 South Australian blackout, the statewide blackout. Look, a number of interesting things in there. It does say, let me find, here it is, the operation of these generators, the wind farms, was not materially impacted by the system faults experienced during these events. What did you learn from that update yesterday?
Well, it's an important document. It's the second report from the Australian Energy Market Operator, and we'll get a further update in December. But it's important for your viewers to understand the sequence of events which didn't change in this report, namely that there was a storm, that knocked out transmission towers. That led to voltage disturbances across the grid. Now, the thermal generation, namely the two gas-fired power generation plants, could actually ride through those voltage disturbances. But because of the settings on 9 out of the 13 wind farms, those voltage disturbances led them to shut themselves down. And that meant that 445 megawatts of power was taken from the system.
And piled onto the...
Piled onto the interconnector. The interconnector then couldn't cope. And as a result, the whole system went black.
And what does that tell you about wind farms? If 9 of the 13 couldn't cope with that, what does it say?
Well, it tells me that Jay Weatherall's big experiment failed. And his big experiment is to move very quickly to more renewables. He's got more than 40% of his power coming from renewables. And better care and attention needs to be taken to integrate those renewable sources into the grid. You see, all renewables are not the same. Hydropower has the characteristics of gas and coal in that it can be generated 24/7. But wind and solar, which is predominantly wind, is what is derived from in South Australia, doesn't have those characteristics. So when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, power's not being generated.
So to be clear here, the storm created the wind generators to go down, but the fact there was a statewide blackout, in your view, is because, in part, of too much reliance on wind.
No, the view has always been consistent. It's because of the storms that led to these effects. But the thermal generators...
But are you saying the gas generators...
were able to ride through.
Were able to ride through. The wind generators weren't.
And that was a question of settings.
So if they had less wind, more gas, this wouldn't have happened?
Well, they're questions that will be answered down the track.
Is it still not answered in your mind?
Well, the point I've been consistently saying, which is if we are to move effectively down the path of more renewables, and we do support that with our renewable energy target, greater care needs to be taken to ensure energy security. So if you go back to June, July in South Australia, there was massive volatility in the electricity market there, and that was in part due to the fact that wind power was not producing the generation that it had previously been producing. And those are the sort of issues, and also the voltage and the frequency, which are very complex technical issues, do need to be resolved. That's why energy ministers came together at COAG, David, to try to agree on what reforms we need to strengthen our system. What happened in South Australia was a storm event. I've always said that. But the issue of renewables into the grid raises real challenges for stability and affordability.
Well, it seems, listening to you, that you are saying that where the gas generators made it through this storm, the wind did not.
And what people will say from the green or the renewable energy sector was it because it was a technical issue on the settings. And to the point that those settings can be changed, that's true. But there are broader issues related to the fact that we can't store, because battery technology is not that far as advanced as it needs to be. We can't store the huge quantities of intermittence.
So is there too much? Is 40% too high for a renewable target?
Well, without other systems to stabilise the South Australian electricity market, that is the real question. And that is why we have raised the alarm about the other Labor states and their unrealistic targets.
Like the 50% target in Queensland.
Remarkably, 50% by 2030, and even though it's 4.5% today. Now, the Queensland Labor government have gone against the advice of their own Productivity Commission, which said that they should not adopt unilateral targets outside of COAG. They have also said, remarkably, that the transition will be cost neutral, where we know from our own modelling that it will cost $27 billion. And that the Grattan Institute, pretty reputable organisation, has said that the Labor Party in Queensland in their document was, quote, magic pudding economics. These are the questions that the state Labor governments in Queensland, South Australia, Victoria have to answer. How are they going to pay for the system? What does it mean for prices? And of course, what does it mean for energy security?
You want a nationally consistent target.
I do.
And it sounds like you're saying it needs to be less than 40% unless there can be some further development in battery storage. Well,
battery storage is the big swing factor, and of course if we can do that, then that will make a real difference. But right now we have a 2020 target of 23.5%, and about 15% of Australia's energy comes from renewable sources today. That's going to be a stretch for us to get there, whereas the state governments are rushing ahead, and Bill Shorten and the Labor Party are rushing ahead with a 50% target by 2030, and Bill Shorten needs to answer, where are the details, who's going to pay for it, because Bloomberg have estimated the cost of Bill Shorten's target at $48 billion, and we see that nowhere in Bill Shorten's budget numbers.
Let me turn to another matter. The United Nations, as I should say, China, the US, a number of other countries have put questions to Australia to explain, for example, how it's going to meet its 2030 emissions target, and they have raised concerns about a lack of transparency on calculating and reporting our emissions. As I understand it, Australia has to respond to these questions by the 28th of this month, is that right?
Well, we have to respond in good time, but we are just one of a large number of countries, including, you know, New Zealand, the US, the UK and other countries that have been subject to these questions and to these reviews effectively. There's more than 40 countries that have actually been subject to these. Now, Australia has rated, in some cases, better than New Zealand and the Netherlands when it comes to the transparency and our standards. In other cases, better than France and Germany. So we've actually been very, very forthright, upfront with our systems, with our modelling, with our transparency.
Specifically, though, China wants to know what impact the repeal of the carbon price here has had. So what is the answer to that?
It lowered electricity prices and the greatest drop on record. That was
but in terms of emissions, I guess, is what they're after, not the price of electricity.
Well, there's two ways I'd say it. I'd say firstly to China, under the Paris targets, they are increasing their emissions by 100%.
So you'll throw that back at them?
I'll throw that back. And then I'd say to about us, I would say we adopted a target of 26 to 28% by 2030 on 2005 levels. According to the G20 numbers, that's one of the highest. The best advice to me, David, is that for our 2020 target, we're on track to beat it by 78 million tonnes, and we've beat our first Kyoto target.
But what's been the impact of getting rid of the carbon price?
Well, it saved households billions of dollars.
In emissions. What's been the emissions impact?
Well, the emissions impact is that the carbon tax was not working in the way that it was intended. We've now got in place an emissions reduction fund, which in terms of cost per tonne of abatement is at $12.10. You know what it was for carbon tax?
A lot more than that.
$1,200 plus.
Well, heading to $1,200 plus over 7 years.
So what would you rather?
But what's been the emissions impact?
The emissions impact is that we have now found other ways to meet our 2020 and our 2030 targets without a carbon tax.
Okay.
That's the answer.
Josh Frydenberg, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us
Good to be
this
here.
afternoon. We're going to take another quick break. Back with more here on PM Agenda.